Hi everyone, my name is Daisy Gideon and welcome to another episode of Real Talk. In this podcast, we uncover the uncharted realities of Lebanon and the Middle East by introducing you to real people with real stories to shift the narrative about this misjudged jewel and the reasons why this region remained so tumultuous. We hope you enjoy the podcast and are grateful to all those who support us through their generous donations. It is only due to your support and contributions that we're able to continue delivering these unexplored, real stories. So thank you. Now let's jump in. Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of the Real Talk podcast. And I want to thank you all for your comments, feedback and engagement, and to the thousands of new subscribers who have made our podcast one of the fastest growing podcasts. So I want to express our deep gratitude to our viewers and our listeners. We're delighted you are finding value in the interviews we're sharing, and we hope that we continue to provide you with more fascinating discussions as we continue to grow. In this episode, we will be delving into the three key topics that have made the news over the last 3 weeks. The Lebanon Hezbollah Israel ceasefire deal that was struck in November, which came as a welcome surprise to many, but nonetheless unexpected because of the haste with which Israel agreed to the deal, considering its bullish reluctance to negotiate a deal with Hamas over the past 14 months and secure the release of its hostages. Obviously, there were benefits for Israel or circumstances that forced or persuaded Israel to sign off on the deal. We'll explore the intricacies of these negotiations and whether, in fact, it can really be defined as a ceasefire, considering the fact that since day one, Israel has violated the terms of the ceasefire more than 300 times. We'll also discuss the outlook for Gaza and the Palestinians in the face of ongoing Israeli aggression, which continues with great ferocity and has been omitted from the headlines of mainstream media. And finally, we'll discuss Israel's recent and swift dismantling of the Syrian regime in a matter of days and the fall of President Bashar al-Assad, who fled to Russia earlier this week. Was Syria the trade-off of a ceasefire with Lebanon? Is Syria a distraction from Israel's annexation of Gaza and the West Bank? These and many more questions will be explored in this podcast with my guest today, Mr. Daniel Levy, whom I consider to be one of the most pragmatic, fair-minded, supremely qualified experts on Middle East issues, and in particular on matters pertaining to the Israeli agenda, especially with regards to the protracted Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So today it is a huge honor to have as my guest, Mr. Daniel Levy. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you, Daisy, and really thank you for those kind words, and it's good to be with you here on your podcast.
Whilst I'm sure many listeners already know who you are and have, and heard your viewpoints over the last 12, 14 months in particular, on independent as well as mainstream media, especially since October 7th, I'd like to take a moment to sing your praises. So, Daniel Levy is a British-Israeli analyst, commentator, author, and former advisor to the Israeli government and peace negotiator. He's currently the president of the New York and London-based US Middle East Project, which focuses on Palestine-Israel issues alongside regional conflicts, trends, and geopolitics, and has been called on many times to give testimony to the United Nations Security Council. From 2012 to 2016, Mr. Levy was director for the Middle East and North Africa at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He was a member of the official Israeli delegation to the Israel-Palestine peace talks at Taba under Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak from 1999 to 2002, and prior to that, at the talks for Oslo B under Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin from 94 to 95. He, alongside with Palestinian negotiator Gaith al-Amari, were the lead drafters of the 2003 Geneva Initiative, which was an unofficial document produced by former senior Israeli and Palestinian officials to demonstrate that through negotiations, solutions could be found for all the issues dividing Israelis and Palestinians. And Chatham House, the independent and distinguished London-based international affairs think tank, wrote of these Geneva Accords that however carefully drafted a peace plan might be, it will go nowhere if it is not embraced by the respective leaders on both sides. And they said that former PLO leader at the time, Yasser Arafat, supported the accord, perhaps tactically, to use their words, whereas Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Ariel Sharon, rejected it. We see that happening a lot these days, and it is the basis for all peace and negotiations, no matter what. Leaders have to commit and be willing, have the will to enforce them. Mr. Levy was born and educated in the UK, where he graduated with a master's and a BA from Cambridge University. Today, he is talking to us from his home in London. Welcome again, Daniel Levy. There is so much to say about you, but your accomplishments are far more than we can give credit to today, but I think we've established the case for your credentials. So thanks again for joining us.
Still a pleasure. No, it's good to be talking to you. And I will just say off the back of that, I've had the what to say, obviously, prior to the events of the last 14 months. But I often found that why should it be me speaking to these issues? And in recent years, especially, it wasn't that I was camera shy, but I would often say, that's a place where you need a Palestinian voice. Don't have someone who's going to support the Israeli government and who's going to dissent from the Israeli government. There is another side that you're not hearing. And I will say that in these last months, I felt that I should step into that breach because these have been such difficult months. It doesn't change the fact that Palestinian and other voices from the region should be heard. But these have been such difficult months for those to get a fair hearing. And if I could in some way use what I recognize is the privilege of being who I am, then it really wasn't for me to not take those opportunities. And I just wanted to share that thought with you, Daisy.
And that's a very important point, because even from my perspective, just on that point, and the engagement from the followers and the people that watch and listen to my content, they really pay much more attention when it comes from an Israeli perspective or from an Israeli voice when they're defending the Palestinians, because you have little to gain from doing that, whereas we know that the Palestinians are defending their cause, but you're doing it on just grounds and because of, as I mentioned earlier, your fair-mindedness. But this is what we want. We want fair-minded leaders in the world and speakers and voices who can educate us and guide us, because not all of us are as informed and have been so educated on the aspects of the Palestinian issue, which has been going for more than 75 years, and the Middle East crisis. And throughout my career, everyone used to say, oh my God, it's so complex. It's just such a headache. And the more and more I've delved into it and studied it and talked about it, I realize it is not really that complicated, but they want you to believe it's complicated. So you will stay away from it.
Exactly. And first of all, putting my voice out there should not detract from the fact that those Palestinian voices are crucial, and they have to speak to the Palestinian experience in a way that I can't. True. And as you say, Daisy, there's something at its core which is not complicated at all about a power asymmetry, about a people denied their rights and freedoms, about the dimensions of power, as I said, in this conflict, and about who has the impunity and the backing. Anyway, I'm sure we'll come on to some of those things.
Yeah, we will get into it. Let me start then by setting the scene. The first topic I want to discuss is the Lebanon Israel ceasefire, which took effect on November 27, after 14 months of hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel, which started on October 8th. Hezbollah has always stated that it would end its attacks on northern Israel, and now we saw it expand deeper into Israel, but only if Israel stopped bombing and massacring the Palestinians in Gaza. That didn't happen, and the exchanges continued until we reached a crescendo 2 months ago on September the 17th and 18th, when Israel carried out the first of a series of devastating blows against the Iranian-backed paramilitary group. And we saw more than 3,000 booby trap pages used by Hezbollah operatives explode, killing approximately 32 people, including children and women, and injuring thousands. The attack was described as many as state-sanctioned terrorism by many nations and international groups, but it didn't deter Israel. 10 days later, they assassinated the Hezbollah leader, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, which really took the world by shock. And a few weeks later, took out his successor, Hashem Safieddin, and scores of other senior Hezbollah operatives. And at the same time, they've launched and continued bombarding all parts of Lebanon, in particular Dhia, where it is the base of the Hezbollah leadership and the community. All areas across southern Lebanon, thousands of villages, thousands of homes have been destroyed, and countless villages completely annihilated. And we see that happened in the Bekaa Valley as well. So from one point of view, Israel was on a high. In fact, Netanyahu's popularity, and I hope you can speak to that, had jumped because of his, Israel's ability to knock out or deal such a devastating blow to Hezbollah. So his popularity went up for a while. I'm not sure if it's still there at the moment. But, they killed thousands of Lebanese civilians, 2,500 to 3,000 now, and maimed and injured 15,000. And some anti-Iranian, anti-Hezbollah elements within Lebanon were celebrating the fact. It was, those areas of the Lebanese community who have felt that Hezbollah has been the hugest deterrent to peace in Lebanon, were celebrating. I heard many people within Lebanon across the world singing the praises of Israel, and I was very, dumbfounded at how short-sighted they were, because I just didn't believe that Israel was coming in to save Lebanon from Hezbollah. But I'll get into that a little bit. You can get into that a little bit later. We can discuss that. But global opinion was clearly against Israel. The Lebanese diaspora, jumped up and down. We had vigils, and I was part of those in Australia, demanding that governments put pressure, our government and governments around the world put pressure on Israel and end its blitzkrieg. And Netanyahu nevertheless continued, and the Israeli Defense Forces persisted until this magical day when we had this, ceasefire come out of the blue. To me, we heard rummagings and murmurings of a ceasefire deal happening for the past month before that. But I find that quite still a surprise. And this is why I wanted to have this conversation with you and find out there had to be reasons for Israel ending its rampage, because it could have easily continued. So my first point to you is, what do you think were the reasons behind Israel agreeing to this ceasefire deal? What was in it for them? What benefits were there for Israel? And there's probably many. So I'll let you now take the floor and share with us your interpretations.
Yeah, and let's acknowledge some of what you said, Daisy, in as much as that pager booby trap attack pretty much fits a classical definition of the deployment of terror. It terrorized a civilian population, and something that has become known as the Dhia doctrine, which was first deployed and vocalized, talked about by Israel's political military leaders in 2006 in the previous very intense exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah, in which Israel openly said, our military strategy involves the targeting of entire civilian neighborhoods. And we saw that deployed to horrendous effect. Of course, what's going on in Gaza has been a degree of criminal cruelty that surpasses anything, but we saw it deployed to horrendous and devastating effect inside Lebanon. As you mentioned, the destruction of villages that will almost certainly never re-emerge, some of which are hundreds or thousands of years old. The killing of relief workers, of medical workers, people being displaced in a mass fashion. So all of that has been going on. And now let's come to what are the circumstances which brings that to at least a plausibly sustainable partial closure, because I'm sure we'll come on to the violations of this ceasefire. Yeah. And I think there are a couple of layers of explanation to unpack here. So let me try and do that. And the first is the terms are actually quite favorable to Israel, and we've seen how that has subsequently played out. So first of all, I think the Israeli officials involved in this would point to the successful delinking, disconnecting of the military exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah to what is going on in Gaza. That was something that Hezbollah said would not happen. It is something that very clearly does happen in this ceasefire. In fact, the terms, the statement, the announcement that was actually made on the morning of the day when Nasrallah is assassinated spoke of, if you remember, the Americans and the French announced that the deal's been reached, we're anticipating the parties. So clearly they had a deal. Clearly the Israelis had hoodwinked them, or they'd changed their mind. I think the former is more likely. That had linkage, because it talked about in the initial, I think it was a 21-day pause that was envisaged in that arrangement, which never saw the light of day. That period of time was going to be used in order to implement both a ceasefire on the Lebanese front and to secure a ceasefire in Gaza. So there was an element of linkage that was maintained. Anyway, the terms, both the delinkage and the extent of American oversight and ownership, the French thrown in there because it's Lebanon for a bit of good measure. They are playing a role, that they have their folks who are part of this oversight mechanism. But this is an American-driven thing. It allows Israel certain very problematic, and they've played out problematically, privileges in terms of how this was going to be implemented. So I think Israel would look at this first of all and say the terms of the deal are really okay. There's a side letter from the Americans, as we know, not the first time that has been done. In 1996, there's a side letter from then Secretary of State Warren Christopher. So nothing new under the sun in terms of how the Americans seek to guarantee Israel's freedom of action and impunity. That's one level, the terms of this arrangement. The second level that we have to look at, though, are the internal Israeli dynamics. And let me comment on that.
Yes.
And here, I would draw attention to two important points. First of all, when it comes to Israeli politics and public discourse, such as it is today, Lebanon and everything else holds a different place to the Palestinians. There is a commitment in the current government, and I don't think it is limited to the members of the current government in terms of the Israeli body politic. There is a commitment to maximalist goals vis-a-vis the Palestinians, to the dispossession, the accelerated dispossession, the continuation and acceleration of ethnic cleansing, and to the settlement of Palestinian land, which does not hold for anywhere else, even though one could say, well, what the hell are they doing going into Lebanon, now going into Syria, which we'll come to. But it is of a different order of magnitude. Actual existing Zionism has always had to be primarily at the expense of Palestinians. So the Israeli coalition, if one goes down to really narrow political questions here, people will be familiar already with the names of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, the hard right partners, even harder right partners of Netanyahu. By the way, the Likud, much of it, Netanyahu's governing party, is indistinguishable ideologically from where Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are often at. But if you want to hold your coalition together and your Netanyahu, anything that even has the word agreement with Palestinians written on the tin is almost an anathema to that coalition, whereas you could do that on the Lebanese front, and that's been borne out by the reality. The coalition hasn't collapsed. There was some criticism, but the cabinet voted in favor of that. Which brings me to the next level, which is partly why Israel went for that deal, is that it had reached a crossroads in the military operation, which intensified, as you shared with us, in September in Lebanon. And the crossroads was the following: having begun a ground incursion, and while that ground incursion was devastating for the affected villages in South Lebanon, it did not go swimmingly for the Israeli side. There were Israeli losses, and this came on top of a period in Israel where the Israeli military were already suffering from manpower shortages, fatigue. People were serving very extensive periods of reserve duty. And so you then had the option of either cutting a deal or the inevitability that momentum would drive Israel in further, requiring further troops. So it was either going deeper into Lebanon with all that entailed in terms of the extra burden on the IDF, or cut a deal. So it wasn't just the terms of the deal. It was also that Israel knew that this was burdensome, problematic for its own side, and at the risk of overloading the cart in terms of what I'm trying to convey here, there's also a specific problem for Netanyahu, which is that the big threat to his coalition is not that anyone's saying, how could you possibly do that in Lebanon and Syria, let alone with the Palestinians? No, that wasn't the threat. The threat to his coalition is he has to balance the interests of the partners in that coalition, one of whom is the ultra-Orthodox parties. And the ultra-Orthodox parties, known as the Haredi parties, their primary interest is right now, in terms of serving their own community, is to keep the funds flowing for their religious seminaries, their madrasas, they're called yeshivas in the Jewish Israeli parlance, to keep the money flowing for their yeshivas and to get legislation passed to make sure that their young people will continue to be able not to serve in the military. So they don't serve in the military, okay? And it's important in that respect to note that it's really hard to win the argument politically that these folks could continue not to serve when those who do serve keep getting called up for more tours of reserve duty. So to get closure and therefore to be able to demobilize some folks, to not place such a burden on the reservists by having a ceasefire in Lebanon, I think Netanyahu hopes will in the coming weeks and months translate into making it easier for him to manage that question with his coalition. So that for me, much more than an anticipation of what was about to happen in Syria, I'm probably preempting something that's coming up in our conversation, much more than that explains how we got to where we got to on the Lebanon-Israel front.
Fair enough. Yes, those were raised, and I think Netanyahu did make those comments about having to refresh supplies for the military, as well as the murmurings of the ultra-Orthodox, and for the last 6 or more months, was definitely increasing in its intensity of not wanting their young people to serve. So let
me just jump in here, if I may, Daisy, because Netanyahu doesn't talk about that because it's what Israelis don't want to talk about. Israelis don't want to give the impression that there are any vulnerabilities, that Israel has been challenged with any of its equities. However, that's not the case. Right. The military has demonstrated that it can destroy everything, but actual urban warfare in Gaza, I think we can say it has been quite scared to engage in. That's why it is one of the reasons, at least, why it would rather destroy everything. Secondly, the Israelis have no political plan that is palatable to anyone, and therefore it only sees things through this military lens. And of course, the economy and other things have taken a hit. So the idea that this has gone, really smoothly for Israel is palpably not the case. Sorry, carry on.
No, and just to your point, when you, depending on where you get your news, you understand it from different perspectives. But the reports coming out of South Lebanon was when they were, coming in, land troops, they were getting ambushed. There was significant loss, military loss to the Israelis. And you saw one or two, because obviously social media prevents you from spreading it, but videos of troops being, Israeli troops and helicopters ferrying them out, injured troops. So they probably didn't anticipate Hezbollah's strength in the south being so, still so formidable. And just on that too, there was the other point, besides the military deficiencies and having, a need to recruit more or give themselves time for their reservists to recover. There's a lot of reservists who are psychologically traumatized. There's so many factors that within Israel and their own troops, they don't want to go back there. We've seen, members of the IDF speaking in Parliament, to the Knesset, not Parliament, on the fact of the on their traumatic condition and the lack of support. But on that point, we still see, well, what we've seen is that they've gone global. We've had, instances here in Australia where they're trying to recruit members of the Australian community to go and fight in Israel, whether they're Israelis or Jewish background or whatever. I don't think it matters. There was, just last week, a report on the fact that they're recruiting Australians to go and fight in Israel, and that has been the case in other countries. So we know that there's a lack of willingness and ability for Israel to continue it with its own forces. And then there was the other point that they're running out of military supplies. And just a day or so after the signing of the ceasefire agreement, I found it quite interesting that America had, signed off on a $680 million new arms sales package to Israel. And again, thinking, okay, maybe that was a sweetener. There's all of these, deals done behind the scenes on what is really needed. So to your point, I think all the points you've raised are very valid, and they needed much more support incentive-wise. They needed military arms. They needed more boots on the ground, and there is the political considerations of the internal dynamics within Israel as well, as you mentioned. What about...
There are two comments on that, if I may.
Sure.
One, this is not the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Israel does not have an endless reservoir of troops, and I think sometimes people bestow upon Israel this sense of omnipotence. That's an easy thing to imagine when you have the backing of the world's overwhelmingly largest military power and economy, the United States. But at the end of the day, the United States is over there surrounded by Canadians, Mexicans, and fish. And Israel is surrounded by people who, it seems, very determined on making it clear to those people that it refuses to live in peace with anyone. So yeah, this really plays into the fact that even when it comes to battlefield balance of forces, Israel does have vulnerabilities, some of which have been exposed. And that point about recruitment, and there've also been well-documented stories that asylum seekers who have been treated with, by the way, not just in Israel, let's acknowledge this, who've been treated with horrible racism also in Israel, they were being offered routes to permanent residency if they would sign up and go fight. But the important thing when you mention recruitments from third countries, Australia or anywhere else, is I think one should make a point of keeping a lookout for if people do go and serve. And if they choose to be amongst the cohort of Israeli military, members of the military, who choose to take to social media and self-incriminate and to capture themselves committing war crimes, then those should be pursued when those people, if they're just Israeli nationals, choose to travel as tourists. People can bring lawsuits. Now, what is accumulated in the ICC, in the ICJ, if there is evidence out there, this can be a civilian project, and certainly if they are dual nationals. So just to acknowledge that there was something else, but it's escaped my mind. So let's.
Well, just on that point, there was just yesterday I received a link from somebody talking about the Australian government also upping its investigations into this area, because previously, and we know that in other countries it hasn't happened. I mean, Britons in particular have been asking for the government to look into those mercenaries that have been sent out, and their, the abhorrence with which they're coming back and publicly saying, yes, I was on the ground and I served. Well, the Australian government just, I'm trying to get this verified, but has announced that it's going to investigate people who, Israeli tourists or people who've been to Israel, to find out whether they have been involved in any military, exchanges or involvement in the war on Gaza or in Lebanon. So I think that there are a lot more countries and governments who are understanding their responsibilities, even though it should have been absolutely clear to them more than 12 months ago what the rules of law are, what international law states. But the stakes are now getting higher for countries, and they are starting to take it far more seriously, in particular since the ICC issued the arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant.
The importance of that, of course, it's the punitive side isn't really the important side. The importance of that is you should know that if you are going to engage in acts of criminality, if you are going to violate the laws of war, if you are going to violate the conventions around which even war has to be conducted,
yes,
then there will be cost and consequence for your personal liability as part of those actions, because that is how you dissuade people. That is how you make people think twice when it comes to how they are going to conduct themselves and whether they are going to observe or refuse to engage in patently criminal orders. By the way, you've had, we're talking now in this respect, the thing I'm going to quote about northern Gaza, but you've had the former Deputy National Security Advisor, the former Deputy Head of the National Security Council in Israel, take to X to say the orders that are being given in terms of Israeli actions in northern Gaza are war crimes. You had the former Israeli defense minister, who's a Likud dude, former chief of staff, a guy called Boogie Ya'alon, making that same point, but only if people feel that they could be held criminally liable. And that second point that you raised, none of this could be happening, not Gaza, not Lebanon, arguably not what's happening in Syria as well, were it not for the constant conveyor belt of weaponry being supplied by the US. Whether there was a little extra leverage that the US finally decided to deploy, it has conspicuously refused to deploy that leverage, despite all the evidence of crimes being committed with American weaponry in Gaza. Whether it finally leaned in a little bit to get the Lebanon ceasefire over the hill to then be able to make that announcement, I'm not sure that was the case. But if it was, then all the more shame on you, America, for not having done it earlier and not having applied it to Gaza either.
Yeah, and I want to just explore this with you. They're now putting pressure on individuals not to get involved in these military activities and war crimes. Where do you sit on the double standards and the hypocrisy on governments being able to now pass the buck on to citizens, rather than, first of all, the citizens are doing it because you did it yourself, government?
Breaking news flash. governments act with hypocrisy and double standards. Of course they do.
Yeah.
I think what has been so apparent in this instance is the transparency of it. The emperor is literally standing in the town square, stark naked, and for all to see. And I think this is where the West has done itself tremendous collective self-harm in a world in which there is no longer American preponderance, primacy, unipolarity, and in a world in which for the better part of 2 years we were being told, why isn't the global South with us? Where the hell are their values when it comes to Russia, Ukraine? Well, first of all, you initially took a whole slew of economic sanctioning measures without consulting with anyone, for whom the hardest hit effect was on food supply security, energy security, inflationary pressures, where you weren't bearing the brunt of that burden, but also because the rest of the world looked at you and said, yeah, we've got you clocked. We know that you apply these selectively. And lo and behold, along comes Israel's actions in Gaza and absolutely proves that case. So the West has done itself tremendous self-harm. But when you drill down and ask the question of why not, at the end of the day, the amazing mobilization and civic actions that one has seen have not yet reached that tipping point. Maybe in certain political spaces, they won't be able to, maybe there is a weddedness to an Israeli narrative. Maybe there has been such an effective, I don't want to make our conversation go off on this tangent entirely, but maybe there has been such an effective preemptive creating of an atmosphere in which false accusations of anti-Semitism could be deployed so as to silence some of that debate. But ultimately, it is for the citizenry in spaces where their influence can be brought to bear to keep challenging, keep pushing, and ultimately to move the dial, win these arguments, and assert that politicians will have a price to pay if they don't do the right thing on this question. And that's very easy to say. It's very hard to do. But I don't think the takeaway should be it won't be done. The pressure on apartheid South Africa did not begin with states and governments. It was people who refused to be complicit in an apartheid regime. It was New Zealanders who made the ability of a South African Springboks rugby tour to take place in New Zealand in 1981, if I'm not mistaken, who made that impossible. There would not be normal sport with an abnormal regime of apartheid. So, all I could say is keep up the amazing work, take it to the next level, because that, in many instances, will be the only way to change things.
Very good point. There's a few other factors I wanted to discuss with you, including in relation to the ceasefire deal. Do you think that the Trump victory and him coming into power in the next, 40 days or so will have an impact on Netanyahu, or had an impact on him agreeing to this? I know you've laid down a very valid case, a very sound case for why they signed the agreement, but do you think that played a role? Was there a consideration as well?
I think it's hard not to consider that was factored in.
Yes.
I think it also allowed Netanyahu to turn to his coalition and say, yeah, we're going to do fabulous things with the Trump administration. Let's set this up on the right foot. They want to see some of this calm down. I don't think we're going to be under too much pressure when it comes to Gaza. We'll probably be encouraged to do our worst in the West Bank. there are reasons to take this Lebanon deal. That's another one of them. So I think that it may have just again greased the passage to getting to that place.
And it is something I want to get into a little bit when we discuss Gaza. But first, Donald Trump. He's such an unknown quantity, and you know, we think we know him, and we're shocked that he actually made it back into power. But we knew also, a lot of people were saying, well, we knew what we were getting with Kamala Harris. It was more of the same, and they weren't going to end anything for the Palestinians, and they weren't going to stop they've showed their weakness. They were controlled by the Zionist lobby and all of those elements. What is your opinion of Donald Trump? And I mean, we've seen him also appoint a lot of pro-Zionist members to his leadership committee. And for me, although I've actually met the man, I had a very nice conversation with him probably 14, 15 years ago. Didn't feel the irk that people have. But I've seen what he did in when in his first leadership and everything that came after that. And I don't know. I'm completely have no idea what he's going to do in his next term, when in relation specifically to foreign policy, to Palestine, the Middle East, Iran. There's some you could probably work out, but I'm really flabbergasted as to how to even begin to frame what he might do. What do you take away from him? What do you anticipate his policies are going to be, or reaction will be?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's a piece of this which is in terms of his return to power, which has to do with the staggering failings of those on the other side to the populist contemporary right that he represents. Their staggering failure to understand that cannot be confronted with a kind of mealy-mouthed version of hey, we're really good, competent technocrats, and therefore you should. So yeah, there's a staggering failure in the US sense on the part of the Democrats, who did everything to alienate much of their base, certainly around Middle East and Gaza, but not exclusively. And I would say the following. I think there are real questions on his foreign policy. That we won't go into China. That has become one of the rare areas of problematic, I would argue, bipartisan consensus in the US. But when it comes to the broader Middle East, I think there are reasons to think that there will be competing camps in the Trump administration, particularly because there is in the mix people who would argue that if you want to focus on some of the economic and anti-migrant battles that he wants to have domestically, then the impetus to not fighting unnecessary wars, which was a theme of his first term, will be in play again, and that can impact how you look at the Middle East, how you look at the Iran question, how you look at this broader conflagration, also the extent of their existing ties, also the family business ties, and the extent of how they see American economic interests in their Gulf relations, depending on how Saudi and other Gulf states choose to position themselves on this, that could have an impact. So while you have a strong hawkish tendency there, you have some balancing factors. What I would, though, say is that neither the Trump first term nor the ecosystem of the modern Republican Party are difficult to decipher when it comes to the narrower question of Palestine and Israel. In that respect, the die is pretty much cast. We do know what the ecosystem looks like, which is an ecosystem of dispensationalist evangelicals who are the strongest pro-Zionist lobby in the US and certainly in the Republican Party. We know what the congressional cohort looks like. We know what the key funders are interested in. And we know what Trump 1 did in terms of moving the embassy, in terms of recognizing the illegal annexation of the Golan Heights, in terms of incorporating the settlements into US-Israeli bilateral treaties. So I think when it comes to Palestine, both the appointments and the track record and the ecosystem all suggest a direction of travel which will intensify American support for Palestinian dispossession and the trampling of Palestinian rights. In that respect, it's going to be a hard few years. America is not the only relevant power in the world, and we need to remember that. And America may well encourage the kind of, again, acceleration of Israeli imperial overreach, and Israeli overreach on the Palestinian front, which may actually hit a wall and really ill-serve Israel. And that can create other new openings.
I do want to ask you, how fragile or how solid is this ceasefire deal for Lebanon?
Let's just recognize that this allows Israel to continue to violate sovereign Lebanese airspace, which it did anyway. Now, it's done that long before the front in this current situation opened on October 8th. Of course, it did it with a different intensity after that, and with a whole different intensity from September onwards. But Israel has permanently violated Lebanese sovereign airspace. That will continue. One should also anticipate that Israel does something which, in the Palestinian context, it calls mowing the lawn, which means that occasionally it will carry out more extensive strikes. If one expects those two things, then despite its fragility, there's a serious prospect that it won't extend beyond that. And I'm not saying those things are okay. I'm just acknowledging what this might look like. There are two caveats to that. One caveat is that on the Israeli side, the residents in the areas that have been evacuated inside northern Israel demand a higher bar, and or Netanyahu sees that his political needs encourage the return to a more intense escalation with Lebanon, and or that he leans into the idea that even more of the job of depleting Hezbollah can be done, and that he's in this, we need to totally remake Lebanese politics and bend that to Israel's will. So if any of those things kick in, then Israel will initiate something that totally kicks the ceasefire into the long grass, and we see a return to what was. I don't think that's necessarily, and probably is less rather than more likely to be the case. Then the other side is, does Hezbollah decide that delinkage or that its own need to reassert its deterrence capacity means that it should break that arrangement? My sense is Hezbollah is now in a period of reassessment, rebuilding, and much more focusing on how it manages its domestic Lebanese equities, that it is not looking to initiate that, or I don't think it would have agreed to these arrangements in the first place. And in terms of the signals it is getting from Iran, those also don't lean towards going for that kind of a strategy of escalation. I think Iran, long before this ceasefire, was already reassessing its national security doctrine. Syria is no longer a pass-through route in terms of how Hezbollah could replenish. And in fact, for some time, it had ceased to be an effective pass-through route because Israel had operational freedom in the skies of Syria also before the fall of the Assad regime. So for those reasons, I think what looks fragile will remain fragile, but there's a very more than decent chance that it won't tip back, with the caveats I mentioned, that it won't tip back into the kinds of intensity that one saw in September, October, November, and probably not even to the intensity one saw before that.
But with regards to the Palestinian question and where it's fallen off the radar because of Lebanon and Syria, and the really going back to the point, let's look at the most important factor we need to discuss right now. What you mentioned about Trump coming in, the Trump administration, and the fact that because of multiple factors, economic and political factors, it is more likely that the Palestinian question and the Palestinian problem will remain unresolved for years to come. But I want you to speak to that and speak to the point you made too, but America is not the only power. And so how do we continue to help Palestine and the Palestinians? How does the world deal with this and what we're facing? Because, we're not going to accept ethnic cleansing, and we shouldn't, and the Palestinians should not continue to be massacred in the genocide that we've witnessed for the last 14 months. So what can we expect and what should we be doing?
Yeah, look, the Western media may have moved on, but Western media has not had people on the ground in Gaza. They have made the choice not to use Gazan citizen journalists, which was an option that was open to them when they could not get their correspondents on the ground. I think that was an appalling choice to have made. And we are still in a reality where dozens of Palestinians in Gaza are being killed on pretty much a daily basis, where the conditions are shocking, where crimes are being committed, where the humanitarian assistance is not being allowed in, and Israel has created intentionally a situation where there is not only an inability to bring that in, but there is looting and criminality, just regular kind of gangs, profiteering has been encouraged by Israel by destroying the mechanisms and the structures that can distribute aid. Also, of course, by launching this relentless campaign against UNRWA. The north of Gaza, this attempt to depopulate, to starve out that civilian population. There are no safe zones in Gaza. And that's before we even talk about what is largely being ignored, which is that there has been a significant intensification of Israeli action in the West Bank throughout this. East Jerusalem is still in a perilous state. Palestinians inside 1948 Israel are facing a level of intimidation, which I think has not been seen for decades. So against that backdrop, and with the imminent return of Trump to government, I think what we have to look at is the following. Despite all of that, Palestinian resilience has been remarkable. Israel, unfortunately, is able to act with impunity because that is guaranteed by the US. But this actually creates a situation that I mentioned in passing earlier, which is, where does this overreach actually take Israel? Because if what Israel thinks it can achieve is to finish the job, so to speak, of the removal of Palestinians from the physical expanse or the squeezing of Palestinians and the completing of the Bantustanization project, then anyone who thinks that this is going to deliver safety and security for Israeli Jews is delusional and has not been paying attention to what happens when people are oppressed under a regime of structural violence. That never delivers sustainable, secure political outcomes for the oppressor. What is more, this is happening against a backdrop of a polarized Israeli society, sadly not polarized around the treatment of Palestinians, but polarized around other things, some of which overlap with that question. And it's happening against what you mentioned, which is a backdrop of a global mobilization on that issue, and Israel facing a whole new set of challenges because the ICJ has ruled, the International Court of Justice, has ruled on the illegality of the occupation, has ruled on Israeli violations of the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which means that it is applying segregation and apartheid. It has ruled on provisional measures because of plausible violations of the Genocide Convention, and it has issued arrest warrants against two of Israel's leaders. That opens the possibility of litigation in multiple national court systems, which don't need to be initiated by governments. In fact, which I imagine will often challenge the complicity of a given government in these acts of criminality. And what I would suggest, therefore, is these are terribly, almost unimaginably hard times for Palestinians. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. And I insist that we don't, for their sake, have the luxury of giving up. Nor is this something that that I think is bereft, is absent openings for challenging that impunity. And so I think we're in a place which correctly looks very gloomy, but in which options for holding Israel to account are coming more to the fore. And we've seen, as I mentioned earlier, several countries in the global south step up, and we need to just keep increasing the ranks of both the state actors and the civic actors who are willing to do something about this. And I think those opportunities exist. And if Israelis, because we've had this conversation, and I want justice for Palestinians. I want Jewish Israelis to no longer be in the position of being oppressors, because I think that is fundamentally at odds with their well-being, and I actually think it endangers Jewish communities as well. So I have that interest also. And I think those things can coincide, but you have to challenge the impunity.
You just reminded me of when I was covering the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel, and I traveled to Israel and was in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. And I remember so many friends in Israel, Jewish people, Israelis saying to me, do you think this is really possible? Do you think we could finally have peace with the Palestinians and the Arabs? Like their faces, because they've grown up with this fear, and it just really came, hit me hard of how difficult it is to grow up in Israel with this system telling you that you're hated or you need to fear. And even in Australia and living in London and America, the same sort of fear. And it was just really sad. It was very sad to see people who just wanted to be accepted and live a life, and yet their own government, with its policy and its indoctrination and its propaganda, preventing this, feeling of I'm safe, I'm okay, I'm normal. They're making, Israelis or, Not all Jews feel that way, but I think they are. That's why the anti-Semitism around the world is picking up again, and that's very devastating. It's shocking, and but you have to take responsibility. So I was, yeah, I understand what you're saying there, and we will not give up. We're part of it's a mission, it's a cause, and as Martin Luther King said, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, and it takes time sometimes. But he finished that. I read this once saying, as long as we remain steadfast to its completion, it's not just going to happen. It needs us to remain steadfast. And that's where people forget, the universe is just justice will prevail. No, no, no. We need to remain steadfast. So look, my final question to you is about the fall of the Assad regime and the swiftness of it. And just what is just your comment? We've got Abu Muhammad al-Julani coming in as a new strongman. We've got a Prime Minister Mohammed al-Bashir, saying that he guarantees the rights of all its people and faiths. We've got the Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, which used to be connected with Al-Qaeda. And, we have so many, when we're looking at what's happened to Bashar al-Assad, God be with you, never come back, as what he did to Lebanon and his father, Hafez al-Assad, should never be forgotten and forgiven, and his own people. So I'd love for you to just share with me and the listeners and viewers a quick summary of these elements that are now taken charge of Syria and what that might look like for the Middle East. And are we really looking at a democratic government coming into play, or are we looking more of a Afghanistan kind of situation?
And I will make it very brief. Look, I think this is a rare, happy moment in the region, and we shouldn't make light of that. And anytime people, whether it's an external foreign occupation or whether it's a brutally repressive internal regime, anytime people are liberated from that situation, that is cause to lift the heart. And we've been talking mostly today about Lebanon, and there are many Lebanese who suffered as a consequence of that regime, including people who have come out of these horrendous prison camps, and including people who were assassinated. However, what happened when people of the region tried to create a new social contract with those who rule them in round one, and I think the Arab Spring didn't begin and end, and it's probably the wrong phrase, the Arab Spring, but this movement, it has carried on.
Yes.
And it faced extremely significant internal and external actors to try and make sure that there could not be a positive model in that region. And that will be the case again. And even where we saw what seemed to be the successful moving on in Tunisia, we're right back with authoritarian rule there. But I don't think that's inevitable. Syria is an incredibly important place in the region, in the Arab imagination. The symbolism of Jolani in the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus will not be lost on people. Is this a movement that has it governed Idlib? And as we've seen these interviews with Jolani, is this a movement that has learned from some of that experience? Way too early to know. Have the Syrian people been through so much that it will be more difficult to try and turn them against each other? Way too early to know. What we do know is that unfortunately there are those forces. Israel has moved in. It's bombed, what a future Syrian successor, hopefully representative governance, would need to protect and defend itself. It's taken those things out in again, an act that totally violates Syrian sovereignty. Not the only one. Okay, here there is probably an exceptionalism to the degree of how Israel has acted. But in terms of those wishing ill to a potentially successful Syrian experiment in a different social contract, the counter-revolutionary front is still there. It's tremendously well resourced. There would also have to be a lifting of sanctions. There would have to be a willingness to engage with people who like HTS. And there may just be this sense that after all that the Syrian people have gone through, that they will not want to turn this in that direction. It's going to take restraint at some stage on the part of enough of those external actors, including those in the West who need to lift sanctions. That's all a very tall order. But after everything Syria has been through, one has to hope and do what one can for that to be the case. And that's the best we can do, and to celebrate with the Syrian people, those who were lost. I don't know if they can rebuild their lives after what they've gone through. But I think anyone who is set on preventing Syria from re-emerging is that's deeply inhumane, and I hope they will not succeed.
Look, yes, it all comes back down to the will of the people within Syria, equally with every country. Look at the power of the Palestinians. We hope that they learn not in the way that the Palestinians have had to learn, but we wish the Syrian people strength and determination to shape their country and take charge of their country themselves, as I do for Lebanon and the Lebanese, and why we work so hard for Lebanon. But I really want to thank you. I've had a fascinating and enlightening conversation with you. I want to thank you on behalf of many, many thousands, if not millions of people too, for everything that you do for justice and humanity. It is, yes, you're championing Palestine, but you're doing it for humanity and for justice, and that's the most important cause that we should all be behind, for all of us to survive as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and have a lovely night. Good night, and I'll be in touch. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Real Talk and experiencing firsthand the real stories told by real people. I hope you found value and meaning, and encourage you to subscribe to my YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Your ongoing financial support is vital to our ability to continue delivering these stories, so please remember to click on the donate button in the description, giving only what you can afford. I spent my whole life giving my time, money and skill to serve human rights and social justice causes, and I know it's not easy to keep giving selflessly. But this work is important because the mainstream media has failed to live up to their obligations. So we need to step up, speak up, or we're no better than them. I believe by tuning in to this podcast, you are someone who wants to know the facts and the truth, so you can independently decide what to believe and what not to. My job is to deliver that information. Yours is to place a value on it. Whatever you decide is humbly welcome. Thanks again, and see you on the next episode of Real Talk.